Louisiana, 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final violent breaths. Thousands of miles away from the crumbling Reich in the deep American South, a train approached a siding carved into the thick green landscape. Its wheels clattered over the tracks, a dull metallic rhythm rising through the humid air. The sky above was a swollen dome of grey, heavy with the promise of rain that never quite came. The air itself felt alive, hot, dense, unforgiving. The sort of humidity that sits on your skin like a second layer, creeping into your lungs with each breath. It was a foreign heat to the passengers inside the wooden boxcars, a heat unlike anything they had ever known in Europe. Inside one of those boxcars, its interior dark and cramped, a cluster of German women pressed their faces against the narrow wooden slat. Their knuckles whitened as they clung to the boards, trying to glimpse the world they were being delivered into. They had heard stories, many stories, whispered by guards, traded among prisoners, passed between frightened hands on transport after transport. Stories of what awaited them once they were captured by the Americans, especially by the black soldiers the Reich had so carefully and deliberately demonized. They were told to expect savagery, humiliation, chains, and treatments so degrading it could barely be spoken aloud. They were warned that these were men with no civilization, no restraint, no humanity. Propaganda had painted them as monsters, and fear had done the rest. The train lurched, metal grinding against metal as it slowed. A shudder traveled down its length. Outside, the platform stretched out, sun-bleached planks, dusty ground, the occasional shimmer of heat rising in waves. The women braced themselves. One of them, Helene, no older than 20, closed her eyes and whispered a prayer in German, her voice barely audible above the groaning of the brakes. Another woman, Clara, gripped a locket around her neck so tightly the metal edge cut into her skin. Some stared defiantly, refusing to show fear. Others trembled openly. Then the train stopped. A long, heavy silence followed, one made thicker by the heat and the weight of expectation. The women leaned closer to the slats. A moment passed, then another, and at last, they saw them. Standing in perfect formation beneath the hazy Louisiana sky were black American soldiers, tall, broad-shouldered, uniforms crisp and immaculate despite the oppressive humidity. Their rifles were held at ease, barrels angled toward the sun. Not a man moved, not a word was spoken. Their discipline was absolute, their bearing unmistakable. These were men who had marched across Europe, bled for a country that still segregated them, fought a war abroad only to return home to a fight of a different kind. But here they were, the first Americans these German POs would meet. The women froze. For a moment, time itself seemed to suspend in the thick summer air. This was not what they had been told to expect. No snarling faces, no wild threats, no mobs waiting to exact revenge. Instead, order, stillness, professionalism, a quiet strength that was somehow more intimidating than the horrors they had pictured. One soldier, positioned slightly ahead of the others, shifted his weight. The sun caught the edge of his insignia, technical sergeant. He scanned the women with an expression that revealed nothing. Not anger, not pity, only duty. It was this silence, this calm assurance that unsettled the prisoners more than any act of violence could have. Because in that moment, they realized the truth. Everything they had been taught about these men was a lie. To understand this moment, this collision of propaganda and reality, we must step back. The women in the boxcar had grown up in a Germany where racial ideology was woven into every aspect of life. Children's books, school lessons, radio broadcasts, posters, all crafted to shape a worldview where anyone outside the mythical Aryan ideal was considered inferior. And of all the groups demonized, few were portrayed with the same level of dehumanizing obsession as black people. Long before Hitler came to power, Germany had struggled to reconcile its colonial ambitions with its self-image of cultural superiority. The defeat in World War I had been attributed, falsely and viciously, to what nationalists claimed was the shame of black colonial troops stationed in the Rhineland by the French. Thousands of mixed-race children, born from that occupation, were labelled Rhineland bastards and later targeted for forced sterilisation by the Nazi regime. Racial hatred was policy. By the time these women were old enough to form memories, the stereotype of black men as savage, brutal, and predatory had already been etched into their consciousness. And so, as the train rolled into Louisiana, those ideas weren't just beliefs. They were certainties, facts as far as the prisoners knew. But the United States Army, segregated, conflicted, and imperfect as it was, presented a different reality. Black soldiers had served in every major war the country had fought, despite being routinely denied recognition, respect, and opportunity. During the Second World War, they were often relegated to support roles, barred from certain combat assignments, and forced into segregated units. Yet many fought anyway, with courage, with the skill, and with a determination sharpened by the knowledge that victory abroad did not guarantee equality at home. The soldiers standing on that platform in Louisiana belonged to units that had endured discrimination within the military, even as they served a nation that had not yet granted them full citizenship rights. But they stood tall, they stood disciplined, they stood proud, and today, they stood as guards. Inside the boxcar, the women exchanged glances, each silently asking the same question. What now? A whistle blew somewhere down the platform. The sound cut through the heat like a blade. A door slid open, sunlight flooding into the cramped space. The first group of women hesitated. Some squinted against the brightness. Others held back, clutching their meager belongings, threadbare bags, small bundles, worn-out shoes. A guard gestured to them, his voice steady but firm. Out, form a line. The women stepped into the open, blinking rapidly. The heat struck them immediately. It felt out as though they had walked into an oven. Sweat began to bead on their foreheads within seconds. The black soldiers did not move. Instead, they simply watched. Their silence was not hostility, it was discipline, something the German prisoners were not prepared for. As the women shuffled into a line, one of them, Liselotte, a former factory worker from Hamburg, realized she had been holding her breath. She exhaled shakily. The soldier nearest to her glanced briefly in her direction. His expression remained unreadable. She looked away quickly, a flush rising to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the heat. Behind her, Clara whispered, "They're nothing like they said." The words hung in the air like forbidden thoughts. The processing center was a collection of long barracks, tents, and open-air stations arranged across a dirt field. Trucks rumbled in the distance, their engines coughing through clouds of dust. Military police walked back and forth, clipboards in hand, shouting instructions to incoming personnel. It was a world of movement, noise, and regulation. The German women were guided toward a shaded area where they were told to sit on wooden benches. The shade offered little relief, the heat still pressed in from every angle. Before them, a black sergeant and two corporals stood behind a makeshift desk piled high with papers, identification cards, and stacks of documents. Each man wore a sidearm and a stern expression, yet their posture remained controlled. The sergeant, a tall man with sharp eyes and a calm authority, began calling names. One by one, the women stepped forward. Helene approached the desk when her turn came. The sergeant glanced at her paperwork, then at her. His voice was deep, steady. "State your full name." She hesitated for a moment, not because she didn't understand, but because she had never imagined speaking directly to a black man in any official capacity. The propaganda had painted such an encounter as unthinkable, dangerous. She swallowed. Helena Bauer." The sergeant nodded, wrote something on her card, and handed it back. Next. That was it. No sneer, no threat, no cruelty, just efficiency. Helene stepped aside, her mind reeling. If the moment had ended there, it would already have been enough to challenge everything she believed. But the day was far from over. By mid-afternoon, the women were escorted across the compound toward the barracks assigned to them. The ground was dusty, the sun relentless. Soldiers passed by, white, black, officers, enlisted men, all moving with purpose. Some of the white soldiers glanced at the German women with mild curiosity. Others ignored them entirely. But the black soldiers remained the focal point. The women watched every movement they made, every command they issued, every interaction they had with other Americans. And with each passing minute, the walls of propaganda continued to crumble. The soldiers were not wild. They were not brutal. They were not unrestrained. They were, in fact, the opposite. One incident, small but unforgettable, sealed the transformation. As the women approached the barracks, a German prisoner tripped on a loose board and fell hard onto the ground. Before any of her companions could reach her, one of the black corporals stepped forward, offering his hand to help her up. For a heartbeat, the woman stared at the offered hand as though it were a snake. Then slowly she accepted. The corporal lifted her gently, dusted off her shoulder and nodded once before returning to his post. No one spoke. No one needed to. The gesture was enough. That evening, as the sun dipped beneath the tree line and the air finally began to lose its suffocating weight, the German women sat on their bunk beds in silence. The barracks smelled of wood, dust, and faint traces of motor oil drifting in from a nearby workshop. Outside, the low hum of cicadas filled the twilight. Helene sat on her lower bunk, knees pulled to her chest. Across from her, Clara leaned back against the wall, staring at nothing. "It's strange," Clara murmured. "They treat us better than we were told to expect." Liselotte nodded slowly. "And better than some of our own treated people back home." The room fell quiet again. None of them dared to say the rest aloud. Better than the Nazis had treated people in the camps. Better than many Germans had treated anyone considered other. Better than they themselves had ever been taught to treat those deemed inferior. Outside, a lantern flickered near the guard station, casting long shadows across the compound. A black sergeant passed by, his silhouette cutting cleanly through the amber glow. He turned briefly to check the barracks before continuing on his patrol. Helene watched him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Something inside her, something that had been formed by years of indoctrination, reinforced by teachers, by neighbors, by the state, shifted. It wasn't admiration, not yet. But it was the beginning of understanding, of recognition, of seeing another human being, fully, clearly, for the first time. Over the next days, the women grew accustomed to life in the camp. They noticed things they had never imagined. Black cooks prepared meals with care, sometimes joking with white soldiers who treated them as equals, sometimes not. In the motor pool, black mechanics repaired vehicles with expertise that was impossible to deny. In the administrative offices, black clerks handled paperwork with the same precision as any officer. None of these roles aligned with the image the propaganda had created. The truth was undeniable. These men were not inferior. They were capable, skilled, proud and principled. And as the days stretched into weeks, something else became clear. They were also living through their own struggle. When a black sergeant attempted to use the officers' dining area one afternoon and was turned away by a white captain, the German women witnessed it, saw the tension, felt the injustice. And something in them burned, not with superiority, but with a new, uncomfortable awareness. The men guarding them were fighting two wars, one overseas, one at home. One night, a storm rolled across the Louisiana sky. Rain hammered the tin roofs, thunder shook the ground, lightning split the clouds with jagged white light. The women lay awake in their bunks listening. Outside, a guard ran from post to post, ensuring everything was secure. In the brief flash of lightning, Helene saw him clearly. A black soldier, soaked to the bone, checking the latches on doors, adjusting the lights, doing his duty without complaint. She watched him for a long moment. And somewhere deep inside her, the last remnants of the lie died. By the end of their first month in the camp, the German women no longer feared the black soldiers. They respected them. Not because they were forced to, not because they had no choice, but because reality had replaced fiction. These men were soldiers, men of discipline, men of integrity, and men who, despite enduring discrimination within their own army, still performed their duties with dignity. For the women, this revelation was more than surprising. It was transformative. Propaganda had told them that race determined worth. But here, before their very eyes, race determined nothing. Character determined everything. As the war in Europe ended and the world slowly began to rebuild, many of these women returned home. Some carried bitterness, others carried guilt, but many carried something else. A memory. A moment on a sweltering Louisiana platform when they first saw American soldiers sitting in perfect formation and realized how deeply they had been lied to. And so history leaves us with a quiet truth. Sometimes the most profound battles are not fought with weapons, but with ideas. Sometimes the most powerful transformations begin not with victory or defeat, but with the simple act of seeing another human being clearly, perhaps for the first time. In Louisiana in 1945, beneath a heavy summer sky, a group of German women looked out from a wooden boxcar, and everything they thought they knew collapsed in an instant, not through violence, not through fear, but through dignity, through discipline, through the undeniable presence of men who carried themselves with honor, despite a world that had not always honored them in return. And that moment, quiet, unrecorded, almost forgotten, became a lesson far greater than any shouted ideology.